Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's program sponsored by the Plant Initiative, featuring Prudence Gibson, author of the new book, The Plant Thieves, Secrets of the Herbarium, with moderator Laura Pistarfi. I'm Paul Moss, Executive Director of the Plant Initiative, and I'm very excited to introduce Prudence and Laura and to start off our 1-hour program. Dr. Prudence Gibson lectures on environmental art and activism at the School of Art and Design at the University of New South Wales in Sydney, Australia. Among her many other essays, articles, and papers, she is author of 4 books: The Rapture of Death in 2009, The Pharmacy of Plants in 2015, The Plant Contract in 2018, and The Plant Thieves in 2023. Prudence is also the lead chief investigator of an Australian Research Council grant that focuses on the value of plants in the Sydney Herbarium. Dr. Laura Pistarfi is adjunct faculty in philosophy and religion at the California Institute of Integral Studies. She is a scholar and writer focusing on trees in the Western philosophical tradition. Laura is currently working on a volume co-edited with Dr. David Macaulay, tentatively titled The Wisdom of Trees, Thinking Through Arboreality, expected to be published in 2024. She works as the director for the Psychedelic Assisted Therapies and Research Certificate Program at CIIS. And Laura is also a Plant Initiative board member. The program will start with a half hour of conversation between Prudence and Laura. For the remainder of the program, Prudence will be responding to questions posed by you, the attendees, that will be presented by Laura as selected from your questions that are posted in the Zoom chat. So if you would like to suggest a question for Prudence to discuss, please post this at any time in the chat, which you can see at the bottom of your screen. This program will be recorded and posted online on the Plant Initiative's YouTube channel, and a link to the recording will be sent to everyone who registered. With that, I'm turning over the program to Laura.
Thank you so much, Paul. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. And I especially want to say thank you to you, Prudence, for being here to speak with me today.
Thanks, Laura.
Yeah, thank you. So as Paul mentioned, we're here to talk about your book, The Plant Thieves. And I was so impressed with the way that the book combines your careful research with exciting stories about both plants and humans, particularly there in Australia, but also across the globe. So I'm really excited to talk with you today. So you have a unique connection to the National Herbarium in New South Wales, which the book project primarily documents. How did you come to this project with the herbarium?
Thanks, Laura. Can I just start by acknowledging I'm actually on Warramai country at the moment. I just want to acknowledge that this land was never ceded, and that I usually work on Gadigal land down in what is now known as Sydney, the land of the Eora people. Again, all of these lands in Australia were never ceded. So what happened was that 3 years ago, I was able to connect with the it's called the National Herbarium of New South Wales. It's here in Sydney, and it has about 1.4 million specimens in its collection. And so we were doing some really fantastic and exciting projects relating to that wonderful collection because it was in the process of being digitized. So in theory, being made more accessible to the public. And so we were able to commission writers and artists and poets and filmmakers to come in and work with us and get to know what all the issues are with the herbarium collection. And so that's been sort of 3 years going into 3.5 years of just working with the botanists and finding out about the DNA work that they're doing and the seed conservation work and tissue culture work that they do. So it was a really exciting and slightly overwhelming project to lead. And what I discovered as I was going along my merry way was I had to kind of go through a very personal process of what I now know as decolonizing myself, because I had really no idea how little information, for instance, there was about women botanists in our collection, even though there are botanical illustrations in the collection, and even though there is evidence of some female collectors in the collection, there's a huge sense of erasure of women, and probably much worse was an almost complete erasure of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's contribution to botanical culture. So I was surprised by that, and I was also surprised by the processes of the gardens, the Royal Botanical Gardens, which owns the herbarium, just those processes of what do we need to do in terms of appropriate naming of plants, because we still only have structures for Latin names and common names. So all of that stuff, which I guess is really obvious on the one hand, I started to interrogate really deeply. And that, of course, led to all kinds of ethical dilemmas and kind of personal dilemmas as a white settler woman who's privileged, who does have access to this information where others do not, and what responsibility I have to tell those stories. So that was kind of the beginning of the process.
Thank you, and thank you for bringing up so many of those issues and topics, and we'll be able to get into some of those in more detail. And I especially appreciate you bringing up the erasure of women and Aboriginal peoples, and just to acknowledge that I'm also a white woman of European descent here in America, United States. Appreciate that as well. And just to continue on that thread of your own personal experiences and your own the way that you connected to the plants themselves, and the way that you talked about the humans' connection to the plants. I'm curious if you could tell us a little bit about when you started seeing plants this way.
So what I wanted to do with the Plant Thieves was, I thought that I'd be very clever and very interesting, and I would really sort of play around with critical plant studies issues that I've been dealing with for years now, about what do we do in terms of valuing plants to better acknowledge our human relationships with plants, and to better kind of break down that hierarchy of humans and other animals and plant life and algae and so on, to just disrupt those hierarchies and to better acknowledge the agency and independence of plants, not to mention the extraordinary kind of capabilities and capacities of plant life that we now know, or now are evidenced through Western science, of course, about how plants can remember and associatively learn, thanks to Monica Gagliano and others, and decision make and communicate. So I thought, oh, well, this is my area of absolute curiosity. I need to do something innovative and interesting as well in order to kind of match these innovations in plant science. So I thought that I would write a book from the point of view of plants and choose, I don't know, 100 specimens from the collection, and try to tell those stories and kind of bring about the agency of those plants. And what I realized was that was just another form of human exceptionalism, and that all I was doing was sort of doing this kind of mimicry. It was awful. The work that I was doing was just really horrible. I hated it. I hated myself. I hated what I was doing. I hated the narrative that I was forming. And I feel like that's a really difficult thing to do. You can't give someone agency. And when I'm saying someone, I'm talking about plants. You can't, that doesn't work. You can't give some people dignity. You can't, that is a kind of a horrifying version of human superiority. And so what I realized as I was going about, as I was discovering these kind of erasures from the collection, it became more and more evident that it's actually the human stories about coloniality and about collecting, and that very imperial drive to, especially for Australia. What we have is, you know, Australia was settled by white invaders in 1778 and just prior. So even Joseph Banks came to Australia earlier. So, you know, around this time in the late 18th century was a period that tied into that incredible global imperial race to find new lands, to conquer plants and people and places. So in a way, Australia is quite unique in that sense, that it was both settled during that period. And so there hadn't really been a history of invasion prior to that in Australia. So the violence that ensued in the late 18th and early 19th century was particularly terrible in Australia, but that history has been whitewashed. So when I was at school, so I'm 54, when I was at school, we didn't learn about any of this information as part of our education. I didn't know anything about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander history or culture or the depth and complexity and sophistication of that culture. And so in a way, I felt really personally, on a very personal level, I felt both ashamed more than guilty, ashamed and hoodwinked. I really felt, as I was starting to learn so much over the last 15 years or so, you know, obviously I knew about contemporary Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander culture. To learn the true stories and to find out about the control, for instance, that Joseph Banks had in forming our Australian culture is kind of horrifying. The level of power that he had. So Joseph Banks came on this one trip to Australia. So in Australia, you guys wouldn't know about this in the US and probably don't talk about it in the UK, but Joseph Banks came to Australia. He was only here around Kamay, Botany Bay in Sydney for about a week. So it was a very short period of time that he collected an enormous amount of plants from here. Then they sailed up to Queensland, and then the boat was damaged. So he spent 7 weeks up there and collected up there. That's it. He went back to London and was extremely friendly with George III and had an enormous amount of control over the development of the Australian colony. And we're only now finding out about how much control he had. For instance, early illustrators were doing drawings for engravings that would go into books that would go back to the UK, but they would be sent to Banks, and then he would do all kinds of things to change those images to better support an imperial notion that Australia was terra nullius, meaning there was no one here. So the argument that Britain has was, we can take this land because no one lives here, and those Indigenous people that do live here are peaceful and are happy for us to be here. And the reality of those early frontier wars is only becoming evidenced now. And so I was starting to see that evidence in the erasure in the collection. So for instance, and it's not really documented because it's not white settler people's place really to do this work. I mean, it is my place to do some of this work, but there's ethical dilemmas around who gets to tell these stories as well. But when I was looking at one of the collection rooms, there's a really interesting little room at the herbarium, which is where all the types are. So the types, many of you will know what a type is, but for those of you who don't know, it's almost like a first edition of a book. So the very first time that a plant is collected, in a Western sense, from the bush, it comes into the herbarium, it gets dried, it gets pressed on the page, it gets labeled, then it's given a name. So once the botanical community accept that name, that very first collected specimen is called a type. So I was allowed into this really small room, and I was really scared because I think I had a coffee with me or something like that. I was like, this is really irresponsible for you, A, to let me into this space because I'm so clumsy, and also to have a coffee with me. Anyway, I was looking through all these amazing specimen sheets, these wonderful Banksias, for instance, and I saw a note on one of the specimen sheets, there was in inverted commas and it said "got by Dan." So I was asking the director of the herbarium about this, and it turns out that this was a very rare example of appropriate acknowledgement. So there was a Scottish botanist, George Cayley, who came from Britain, was collecting all around Melbourne and Sydney, and he found this young Aboriginal man called Daniel Mawatan, Dan, who was taking him to all these locations to find all these plants that there's no way he would have known to find. Because I don't know about what it's like in the US or the UK really, but the Australian bush is a really interesting place. Like, you can walk through the bush, and I've got bush right outside my window right now. You can look out that window and it looks kind of uniform. It's like, there's the bush. And then you walk through it, and if you're looking for one particular species, let's say you're looking for the Banksia serrata in the bush, your eyes kind of get accustomed to that particular plant. And if you start to look for all the particular plants in the Banksia scrub, for instance, the multiplicity of the bush, it actually becomes it's a visual skill set almost to kind of see the multiplicity in the bush. Anyway, this young boy, Daniel Mawatan, took George Cayley around, resulted in an enormous amount of plants being taken back to the UK and also into the collection in Sydney. And then, because their friendship became quite strong, George Cayley, the botanist, Daniel Mawatan, the young Aboriginal man, he was only about 13 or 14 when he first started working with George. George decided to take him back to London, so put him in Western clothes, gave him a pipe, took him back to London, introduced him to Joseph Banks, introduced him to alcohol. Didn't really work out very well. He stayed there for about a year. And when George and Daniel then had to bring him home early, George had to bring Daniel home early because his behavior was getting more and more erratic, probably because of the alcohol. When they came back, young Daniel decided he didn't want to have anything more to do with Western white people, so he went back to his people. But unfortunately, 6 months later, he was accused of raping a young settler woman and was sentenced to death. So he was, in fact, the first Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander person to be officially executed. There had been many massacres before then, but this was the first time someone had been there's a record of that execution. So, just that little phrase that I sort of tripped over just by chance opens up this kind of whole and horrifying story that I felt like I had to tell.
Thank you for that. And that leads well into my next question. Especially taking into account the history that you've shared in your own situation, I was struck in the book by your connections with Aboriginal and Indigenous scholars and leaders that you shared in the book and stories. I'm curious if you could tell us more about that, and also maybe talk a little bit about what gives you hope that this connection between humans and plants in the Western dominant culture could become more respectful, or what could non-Indigenous people learn respectfully? If you could share a bit about your own process.
Yeah, thanks, Laura. So there were kind of these two issues that kept sort of smashing me around the ear. One was that very colonial history of the herbarium and the necessity for me to learn to very slowly try, at least, decolonize myself, which for me just means better understanding my privilege, better understanding access that I have, better understanding the necessity for me to ask permission every time I go into a place, which hopefully we'll have time to talk about my trip that I just got back from, but asking permission from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leaders, consulting whenever I can, appropriately and respectfully, doing that in an ongoing way and not doing it afterwards, not tacking it on at the end and going, oh, I better do that because it's what is expected. It's almost like, for me, aesthetics comes at the beginning of the day when I wake up, And so does that kind of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander best practice awareness, at least. I'm not saying I'm especially good at it. I just know that I've got to get a lot better at it. So I was really lucky. There was the ability to meet and get to know some incredibly wonderful and sometimes very funny Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander experts in plant studies. And in fact, the gardens had a Indigenous liaison officer who was able to help me navigate some of those meetings, which can be really clumsy for white settler people, especially me, because I'm clumsy by nature anyway. So that was a real benefit to me to have that kind of advice and consultation as I went. But one example is Jerry Turpin, who's like, he's up at Cairns, up in North Queensland, which is, far North Queensland, as opposed to the deep south. And he runs the tropical herbarium up there. And so his role is really complex, actually. So he has to work out what to do with the plant collection there in the tropical herbarium, but he also has to go out and consult with mob constantly to find out what they want him to do in his role. And sometimes, as you can imagine, that doesn't match up. There's time frames, which he described to me as Murray time, which I thought I understood, but really hadn't understood until I spoke to Jerry about it. And one of the stories that he was telling me about the kinship for his mob with animals and animal spirits. And so I was asking him if he had a token plant as well as a token animal for him with his family. And he was like, no, I've got a token animal, but there's no token plant. But later he was talking about this particular plant that he was very interested in doing more research with, and which he felt a real affinity and connection to. And I was like, oh, I thought you didn't have a token plant. And he was like, Prudence, just shaking his head as though I was the stupidest person in the world, which of course I am in this sense. He said, Prudence, culture is not stagnant, it's ongoing. And I know that's a small thing, but it kind of blew my mind, because the way we're taught in terms of Western history or Western philosophy is often, it's very chronological. It's a very sort of Western linear system of learning. And this kind of suggestion that culture is like the past, the present, and the future all at once is, it's kind of an exciting interruption to everything that, well, for me, everything that I thought that I knew. So philosophically, it was really kind of mind-blowing. And just in terms of culture as being something that, of course, it's regenerating constantly. It's not something that, formed before and we're now just living in a very inert, mimicking way. So in terms of the wider question around, maybe I could tell the story about my recent trip now, Laura. Would that be appropriate?
Sure, of course, please.
Okay. So for those of you who are in the US, I spend most of my time in Sydney, and the other main part of the book that emerged was the psychedelic plant community, the psychedelic plant collection in the herbarium collection. So we've got this one big issue of coloniality and how to decolonize collections, and that whole history of that imperialist fervor to collect at any cost. And then the second issue that really emerged was this question of psychedelics, the secrecy around it, the confusion, the lack of information, and also the psychedelic community in Australia. It's huge, of course, but it's also a little bit underground in some ways as well. And there are similar issues with First Nations people and the psychedelic community, which is neither of those communities really trusts mainstream culture, with good reason. And so the information from both is hard sought, hard to come by, hard to access, and actually kind of a burden. And I've found that, and it's not ongoing for me, like this didn't finish once I handed this into the publisher. These issues of sensitivity are ongoing. So one of the people that I met through the process of discovering these psychedelic plants in the collection and understanding that the gardens actually purposefully do not share the latitude and longitude location of certain psychedelic plants, because people go in and just over harvest natural habitats on common land or national parks land. So that's a real problem for conservation and for endangerment and potential extinction. So I met this really lovely guy called Liam Engel, who was actually a cactus guy, but he's really knowledgeable about all the different psychedelic plants in Australia. So we have psychedelic acacia, which many people don't know about. And so there's 11 species of acacia that are really high in DMT, which is the psychedelic compound in acacia, as you would know, Laura. And then we've got a lot of sort of native or endemic magic mushrooms in Australia that are similar to psilocybin mushrooms elsewhere in the world. So one of the acacia that has a very high psychedelic content is endangered because it only grows in this one particular location on this one particular mountain, and it's just been a real problem with people going in and ravaging it, because those of you will know that with the psychedelic acacia, it's the DMT compound is in the bark, it's in the leaves, the phyllodes, and the roots. And so people don't actually know that this particular one, it's very high in the phyllodes or the leaves, and they don't need to strip it, but people have been going in and stripping these trees, and of course they then die. So I rang loads and loads of people at this location, which is a secret at the moment, and this particular species of acacia, the name I don't think I should mention, because Liam and I are grappling with whether it's better to share that information and come up with better strategies of conservation and care, or to continue this secrecy, considering everyone that wants the psychedelic DMT already know about it, if you know what I mean. So what's the point of keeping it secret if everyone who wants to use it or overutilize it already know? So we kind of went up there to this location. We found national parks, a retired national parks ranger who was able to take us up this ridge, which was so steep. I was literally it was like rock climbing, and we were sort of sliding back down the hill afterwards. And so we found on this ridge there were about maybe 1,000 plants, lots of saplings of this acacia. So it's growing really well. There were about 50 or 100 that had been stripped and cut. I have no idea how these people got that material back down the ridge, because it was so steep. But obviously they have. And the big problem is not so much, oh no, it's nearly extinct, because it's thriving up there. But, you know, like you guys, we have the threat of bushfire all the time. One bushfire on that one ridge, it's all gone. So the question is, do we start talking about it more? Do we start propagating it down on the flats, for instance, or elsewhere? These are really difficult ethical issues. As Paul has mentioned, what about Indigenous knowledge around this acacia? Is there kind of cultural stories telling or secret men's business? I know that there's other acacias that are secret men's business. So only a very few men, Aboriginal men, know about that acacia. This acacia we don't actually know yet. And so there's all these kind of moral and ethical issues around plants that are really difficult to deal with. And I often have this sense of, should I be participating? Because I'm now completely obsessed. You know, I'm way too far down that rabbit hole of critical plant studies. There's no way I will see the light of day ever. So I've accepted that. But what's my role? What's my responsibility? What should I be doing? What shouldn't I be doing? How much should I be telling? How much should I not be telling? How much should I be buying and growing in my own garden? So so there's these kind of moral and legal issues, excuse me, around psychedelic plants as well. So that they're the two issues that really came out in the book. Indigenous knowledge, in response to this kind of need to decolonize the collection, where there's not even appropriate naming yet. Like tri-naming is talked about a lot, but it's really hasn't been achieved yet. And then this other issue of psychedelics.
Thank you. And I think one of the things that comes out both in the book and what you're saying here is just how you've had to, in a decolonizing way, step back yourself and ask lots of questions, and especially the acacia that you're mentioning, the way that it brings up so many ethical issues and who decides what happens with that particular acacia or that particular ridge, and the secrecy around it, and your own particular your place in it. I'm curious if there's anything else regarding ethics that where the Herbarium Project changed your views that you'd like to speak to.
There is just one more thing. One was, we talked about at the beginning, this kind of independent agency of plant life, which we, of course, those of us here today will already be reformed, I'm sure. But there's this other question around, if we think of morality as good and bad, right and wrong, there's this other element of plant life. And how we all anthropomorphize plants and try to make them human because it's just easier to understand the world if we make them everything more human-like. It's one of our human flaws. Is also this concept that plants are always good. So, every element of culture that we see in terms of commodity and that kind of thing is, if you're having plants, if it looks planty, it looks natural. If it looks planty, it looks healthy. It's good. We never think of plants as bad, but of course plants have a multiplicity, a range of activity. The amount of plants that are around me here in the bush and down at home that are poisonous is amazing. So, one of the plants that I was looking at when I was writing the book was the Dieffenbachia, which is also known as dumb cane, like D-U-M-B. And the reason is that if you eat the leaves, your whole mouth swells up and your throat and your tongue swells up so that you can't speak, hence the word dumb. And so it's really very poisonous, and with a very high dose you can die from Dieffenbachia, but you can buy it everywhere. So in Australia we have Bunnings, or Mitre 10, but you probably have like chains of hardware stores in the US and the UK where you can just go and buy any plant. Every single Bunnings store I've been to has a Dieffenbachia. It's got these variegated leaves. It's an indoor plant, can't kill it. So, they're very common. What was really interesting to me was to find out the history of the Dieffenbachia. So the Dieffenbachia was used in the 18th and 19th century, 17th, 18th, and just the beginning of the 19th century in the Caribbean as a means of not feeding the enslaved people that were working on the sugar plantations, but as a means of controlling them. So it was like given to slaves who were causing trouble to silence them as a punishment for bad behavior. And then as a result of that, there was some work done during that period pre-World War II about the effects of dumb cane to also work as an abortifacient, like as to stop pregnancies, but also to sterilize women in the first place, short-term sterilization. So sometimes you could have a certain amount of the Dieffenbachia. It would cause sterility for women for, let's say, 10 days or 5 days, or depending on the dose. And unfortunately, Himmler, not the Nazi officer Himmler, found out about this work because a Swiss doctor had been writing a paper about these effects post-Caribbean enslaved plantations. And so Himmler did his own research and actually did some testing of Dieffenbachia on people in the during the war and in the concentration camps, and was at the point where he was going to try to propagate Dieffenbachia or bring it in big amounts to Europe. And then he had trouble. it wasn't propagating well in Europe, so the whole plan was abandoned. So it's kind of like these really violent and really negative stories around plants, they sort of have to be told as well. And it's not that I want to disrupt everyone from thinking that plants are always good, but it's just as bad as thinking of them, of flattening them aesthetically, or flattening them philosophically. So, you know, I feel like I have to tell those bad stories as well about plants.
Mm-hmm. I think it's important to tell some stories about plants, and in that way to think about plants as whole beings, and also the way that humans have used and misused plants as well. So I'll ask just one more question, and then we'll go to some questions from everyone else. I'm curious if you have any advice or suggestions to offer to people who would like to see plants treated more respectfully.
So in the my previous book, The Plant Contract, which was much more academic than this one, The Plant Thieves is more mainstream, mainly because I just wanted to reach more people and share the stories a little bit more broadly. But in The Plant Contract, I was arguing that art or aesthetics is a really powerful means of returning humans to the vegetable world. And that obviously in light of climate change and extinctions and endangered ecologies, and seeing that all happen around us, you know, all of our students and children and grandchildren are feeling so lost. Like, for instance, this term, all of my students were writing papers. It's a course called Socially Engaged Art, and all of their project proposals were about care and mental health and community. So, you know, I get a sense of what young people are thinking about through my role as a teacher. And there's a real sense of, you know, impending doom and lack of agency and isolation. And that's partly probably because of COVID, but also because of the way we're all on our phones, and I'm as guilty as anyone. I have my phone with me the whole time. So all of those kind of all of that social fallout from COVID and from the way we now live and from this sense of accelerating climate catastrophe, I think is having such a huge effect on younger people and middle-aged people and older people, of course, as well. And so in the book, The Plant Contract, I was arguing not just that art could return us to the vegetable world so that we kind of feel better, but as also as a point of conservation. And that if just one person looked after just one plant as a contract, to take Michel Serres' idea that we have broken the bond with nature, my idea for the plant contract was, what about we try to repair that bond? What if just one person made a pact with one plant and grew it and gave it away and propagated it and loved it and made friends with it and got to know it and watched it grow and got excited and jumped for joy when there was like a little bit of growth that week or whatever it is. Apart from it being such a joyful preoccupation, I think it's also really good for mental health. And obviously it's good for conservation. And, you know, my children think I'm completely insane because of all of my plant interests and my plant obsession. I mean, I belong to a group called the Dirt Witches, which is like a group of women who do activism as well. And we've just built this forest in the city here in Sydney, which has just been made permanent by the City of Sydney Council. But there's so much to do around plants. And so I think better care, I'm really interested in this concept of an aesthetics of care because that's my area, art and design, and I teach in an art and design school. I can see that art is a secret weapon. Aesthetics is a secret weapon, and that I'm including writing and poetry and all forms of art making in that group. And of course, Giovanni Alloy is, like, you know, our supreme leader of critical plant studies in terms of applications with visual art and art history. But I just feel like it's great to have these secret weapons, to have a way to work with plants And just working with plants makes our individual lives better, our communal lives better, and hopefully maybe improve the future if possible.
Thank you. It's inspiring. I love that connection of one person with one plant, really making it individual and specific and local as well.
Exactly, local.
We have several questions from the audience, and we'll get through as many as we possibly can in our time together here. And the first question that we have is, did learning more about Native Australian cultures, Aboriginal cultures, increase your understanding or awareness of plant uses, such as medicine and other plant uses?
I am going to be a little bit careful about answering that question, because bush medicine, similar to bush tucker, has been inappropriately appropriated by non-Indigenous peoples. So there's been like a history over the last 20 or 30 years, for instance, of famous chefs in Australia becoming very interested in that kind of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander knowledge of plants for food, the food industry, and not acknowledging appropriately that information and knowledge. And likewise with bush medicine, there's a million books that you can look up and a million places online where First Nations people have shared that knowledge. I'm not really comfortable doing that because it's not my knowledge to share, number one. But there is this really incredible woman down in Melbourne, Naarm, and her name is Zena Cumpston. Zena as in Z-E-N-A, Cumpston, C-U-M-P-S-T-O-N. And she is an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander woman who's done a lot of work with naming plants. And she's done a really beautiful book about that. So maybe later I could, if anyone's interested, they can just email me and I can share her profile. And I think that going to those sources is probably better than me speaking on behalf of those communities.
Yes. Thank you. And thank you for your care with that, with your answer in that. So we have this is a comment from someone in the audience, and I will do my best to pronounce these words. Thanks for your help in the pronunciation. And so I'll just read the full comment and then let you respond, Prudence. So the comment is, Walawani from the Yuin Nation. Your story reminds me of a particular plant which was specifically used for childbirth on the Mother Mountain here. It can be propagated and is now lost, as that knowledge was shared to people who disrespected country. And the Mother Mountain is Gulaga.
Wow. That's incredible. I've actually been doing a little bit of research on the island of Antigua. Yes, this is my new rabbit hole of research insanity. So I was just sort of randomly looking for Scottish female botanists a while back, and I came across a woman called Maria Riddell, and she went on this trip in 1788 to 1790 from Scotland to Antigua in the West Indies. And she wrote a book about her journey, which anyone can find online. I think that this is my next project, is to write in detail about her life and the life of another botanical illustrator who lived on Antigua at the same time. But Maria Riddell and this other woman, Lydia Byam, who was already living on Antigua as one of the slaver families, they both mentioned this plant called the silk cotton tree, which was also used in certain doses as an abortifacient, and also used, sorry, it's not funny, also used for male sexual disorders. And even the Dieffenbachia was in its very, very, like a lot of these plants, which are poisonous, were also in very small doses supposed to help with childbirth as well. So that's a connection to your previous, the previous comment. These plants are so, so it's so multitudinous, so have such capacity. And I really love this idea of cure or poison, that it's all about the dose, that pharmacopoeia kind of question of how much do you have, how much is too much, how much is too little, is the never-ending question, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yes. We have so many great questions and comments here. So the next one is about your writing process. Can you say more about your writing process and about maybe more about your first draft? This person's asking how long it took to complete your first draft, especially with your research. I know you mentioned your research was at least 3.5 years. So maybe if you could share a bit more about your writing itself.
I love talking about writing. As I mentioned, my first draft was a horrifying pile of rubbish and will never see the light of day by anyone, because, as I said, I was trying to be too clever, and it didn't work. So that was an enormous waste of time. But in a way, that's not a waste of time. Like when I was doing my PhD, which was actually a creative writing PhD, I actually spent the first year writing a novel, realized I hated it, and then completely, pivoted and did a traditional PhD in art writing, and there was quite a few chapters on plants in there. But so my writing process, I write really quickly, and I have a rule that when I come back to the writing the next day, I try not to just edit what I wrote the day before. I write a little note at the end of each day about where my headspace was, so that I can just keep going, because otherwise, it takes too long. And then, maybe once a week, I'll spend the whole day editing everything that I've written that week. And I guess my rule is, when I'm writing, is that if I can, and we've all got family and jobs, etc., it's not easy, but to just at least spend 1 hour per day doing it. What I was doing with the Plant Thieves was writing in a way that I hadn't really written for a while, which was that it was from the first person point of view as well. So in some ways, it's so risky writing the first person, that slight memoir-esque kind of tone, because either people like you or they hate you. So there's a risk that, you're revealing something of yourself and not everyone's going to like you. Of course not. So I did want to do that a little bit, because it felt like this was my story to tell. This was my, for want of a better word, my journey through the herbarium collection, and my joyful experiences of meeting all these absolutely incredible, generous people. There's something about plant people. So we've got, how many people? We've got nearly 90 people here in the room. I know this is controversial, but plant people, us, we're nicer than everyone else. That's just an absolute fact. So so my writing process was really difficult. I actually wrote all my little chapters, which were like sort of vignettes along the way. And I wrote each chapter on a yellow sticky note and stuck it on my wall in my home, and asked one of my sons to come over. And he walked next to me, and I said, that chapter is about blah, blah, blah. And he was like, boring X, right? So he pulled it off, chucked it out. Next one, I was like, that chapter's about this. He was like, oh yeah, I'd give that a 3 out of 5 or a 4 out of 5 in terms of whether it's interesting or not. I just wanted a mainstream person to tell me what was boring and what's not, because those of us in the plant world, we do get a little bit obsessed with detail, and maybe that's not interesting. So I did that with George, and then I reworked it, and then I reordered it and wrote a narrative that tied it all together, gave it to a friend. She suggested huge changes. So it actually went through, I know it comes across as quite a simple book, but it actually went through quite a huge amount of revision. And that was before it even went to the wonderful editor, who I just don't think I can write another book without her. She was so helpful. But I do love writing. there's something about writing which is you go into this other world, don't you? And you live in this kind of liminal space where you're in the stories that you're telling, but you're also in the real world. And you kind of like, you just feel a little bit out of it the whole time, because when you're not writing, you're thinking about what you should be writing. And it may not be pleasant for people around me, but it makes me very, very happy.
I can agree with you on the writing, and I appreciate how you're bringing forward how much of writing is revision and editing. At least for myself in my own process, when I get to that point where I hate what I've done, I know I'm getting somewhere. I've just found that it's part of the process, and once I get there, all right, I'm starting to get somewhere now.
So true.
So the next question is, how do we encourage a human culture of stewarding our relatively undisturbed natural areas rather than seeing them as more empty space to exploit? I think this is coming from somewhat of a Western perspective as well, and ultimately destroying the biodiversity within them. And this person says, either by clearing or by death by 1,000 cuts, by allowing invasive species to proliferate.
Oh God, it's such a good question. And just because I went on this recent trip, so this acacia grows in a national park on a ridge, on a mountain by the sea. And we wore full clothes and gloves because it was so steep. We were kind of going like that up the hill, and you do grab onto trees when you're climbing such a vertical ridge. And so the retired national parks guy suggested we wear gloves. I've actually never done that in the bush before. So it was really interesting, because at first we thought he was trying to protect us. And then we realized, no, of course, he's trying to protect the plants and the other trees that we might be grabbing onto or scrambling. Look, it's such a difficult issue. Like, I've got the coastal bush outside my window here. It's national parks. It's exquisitely beautiful. There's 2 tracks that go down to the beach. It's full of B2 bush, because of what happened, and I'm sure you all know this, but when Australia was first being settled / invaded, there was lots of trips coming down from the UK around Africa and then down to Australia. And so they would often stop in South Africa and pick up different varieties of plants along the way, so they didn't have to, I guess, last or survive for so long. So we actually have a lot of South African plants that were used in good faith to help with sand dune erosion, things like that. And the B2 bush is one of those introduced species that they've got really glossy leaves, but they're super invasive. So the local council here, the land care groups, it's an ongoing plan. It's an ongoing process. But the question that your attendee mentions is, should we even really be going in the bush at all? Like, sometimes I'm not even sure. Like, I was walking down to the beach yesterday, and there was like an abandoned tent, an abandoned skillet, all the boxes that the tent came in. So it had obviously rained, and they just left it there. I mean, it's so shocking on the one hand, but people are people. I don't know the answer to that. And I'm really conflicted about, for instance, growing this acacia that's endangered, that I'm sort of chasing the story. I'm conflicted about that as well, because what if I accidentally introduce somehow some kind of, I don't know, different variety somehow, it gets cross-pollinated with something else, and then, I've ruined the genetics of that acacia. There's so much responsibility. It's sometimes a little bit overwhelming, but on the other hand, it's so important for us to get out into nature. So that, for instance, you could argue that there is no remnant scrub left in Australia at all that hasn't been touched. And it's a big continent. Australia's a big continent. So I guess we can't be too puritanical or purist about original habitats, because there is no such thing in here anyway. I'm not sure. What do you think, Laura?
Yeah, I agree with you in terms of your comment about no land that's untouched, especially with climate change and other global environmental changes. Um, that's one aspect of it, and then of course there are the gardening aspects of it that indigenous cultures have been working with the land for a long time, and I think it is kind of that Western perspective that the land is untouched as well. So I think that's just something to be careful about.
That's very true. I forgot about gardening. And actually, Professor Katrina Sandilands, who many of you will know, who's based at York University in Canada, she has edited a really interesting issue on gardening for Ecozone Journal, where all the articles kind of grapple with that, those concepts of the construct of the garden, and the very coloniality of it, etc. Those of you who are interested.
I wanted to note this comment for you as well, and this is also from someone in the audience who says, "I'm a Native American based outside of Seattle, and if you're interested in networking with tribes and plants and what they're doing here, let me know." And
Yes, please.
decolonize and hashtag land back, which is such an important piece of reciprocity in terms of the land back movement. So just wanted to name that,
That would be
comment and let you
that would
respond.
be awesome. I would love that more than anything. That would be so incredible.
Yeah, we'll make sure you get the comments so you can connect with
Thank
that
you.
person. Yeah, and if you're still here, so you can connect with Prudence as well. And maybe we have time for one more quick question if you're up for it. And so somebody asks, we humans have cultivated, captured, and made use of plants for millennia. What, if any, benefit do we as humans bring to the plant kingdom?
So Monica, you all know Monica Galliano, who has worked as a scientist and published a lot of work about the capacity of plants to remember and learn. She has been probably the most influential person. I mean, she's my friend as well, but as a scholar and as a philosopher, just her wide-ranging knowledge and her quite magnificent approach to life. She has so much courage. And so some of you will have read her book, Thus Spoke the Plant, which was really a story about her experiences in the Amazon, getting to know some plants and being kind of led by plants in her research. And she's been really helpful for me. I mean, she's always 10 steps ahead of me. So when I first saw her give a conference paper in 2014, she was kind of like, her energy was so bouncy and exciting and lively as she was talking about an experiment that she had just done, which was about the mimosa plant, which when you touch, it retracts its leaves. And she did all these experiments to kind of show that the plant would stop retracting its leaves once it knew that it was not in danger, kind of thing. And so recently I was talking to her about this very question of the relationship between plants and humans. So we've all worked so hard not to flatten and plants and not to be reductive about plants, and try very hard not to anthropomorphize plants, which is impossible. Try to allow space to acknowledge and appreciate the independence and agency of plants, all of that stuff. And in a way, that does put plants on a pedestal. And I guess I've always have been arguing along the lines of plants exist with or without human, not just with or without human presence, but actually with or without human consciousness. I've been arguing that for a while. And she kind of pulled me up recently and was like, no, but the way things are now, it has to be more symbiotic, just because of the circumstances that we've just said, which is that there is no such thing as remnant bush now, really. We can't just look out. I wish I could show you, but I won't because it's too glary out there because it's very early morning. But, you know, the bush outside my window, it looks perfect. It looks untouched. It looks natural. But of course it's not anymore. It's it's compromised by human activity, and now we have to look after it. So I have changed my view about that sense that plant life, that romantic idea of plant life as other.
Yes, and such an important point, and a good point to end on about how we can do that carefully. So, and I just want to say thank you so much, Prudence, for this wide-ranging and deep talk together about the plants and the herbarium and your books. Very much appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks to you, Laura, and thanks so much to Paul. And can I just give a little shout out to the 4 people who have been so enormously generous to me, just in my wider research: Monica Galliano, Kate Sanderlands, Giovanni Alloy, and Michael Mata. I just want to acknowledge their kindness to me and generosity. And, you know, that there's something about the plant world, you know, if anyone wants any help from me as well, like, you know, we have to help each other. This is a beautiful discipline that we're all working in. And if there's anything I can do to help anyone else, please let me know, because it's a wonderful place to be in.
Thank you so much, Prudence. Really appreciate it. And Paul, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, thanks. This will just take a moment here. I just wanted to thank both of you so much again, Prudence and Laura. And also just to note that, you know, we will be having some more events in the future. There's going to be one on January 31st with Alessandra Viola, who's going to be talking about plant intelligence, rights, and ethics. And you can find out about that on the Plant Initiative website, plantinitiative.org. We're also having a meet and greet next week on December 6th, which you're all invited to. So just wanted to thank you all very much for attending. And if you like to support these kinds of programs that the Plant Initiative is doing, feel free to always, we're always appreciate donations made on our website. But anyway, thank you so much to everyone. And we really appreciate your being here today. So thank you.